Well, hey friends out there in YouTube land, Robert Hamm here with Robert Hamm Photography. As you can see, I've got this absolutely beautiful TL70 with me. I've been having a blast with it. I wanted to give you a couple of tips for shooting with this camera real quick. The first thing to know when you get this camera is you're going to have an aha moment when you realize that this is not point and shoot. There's a little bit more going on in here. That's not to say that the learning curve is steep. It's just to say that you should be paying attention to many things about this camera as it goes on. Luckily, this top 5 that I'm going to give you right now will help you continue that line so you don't make the mistakes I did. So the first thing that we want to talk about really is the fact that the camera waits for the shadows quite a bit. Actually, shooting out here in this garden today at f5.6 wide open with negative exposure compensation or no exposure compensation has proven beautiful results. I have a great time out here, but that's also because I understand the kind of shade that I am. It's a very bright day, some very indirect and mixed shade is coming through, and then some other parts are direct shade. So make sure you're reading the light. If you see spotches that are highlights that come through on the ground where you see shade, if those edges are defined, then you are in a mixed shade environment. You're definitely going to want to use negative exposure compensation. If you are in an environment where there is no highlights coming through, then you can use your regular EC control with no plus or minus, just centered at 5.6. And I would not suggest using positive EC out here unless you're shooting backlit, like if you want to shoot upwards. The second thing to know about the camera is, although extremely capable, it's going to begin using the slower shutter speeds whenever you tell it to take longer exposures. And if you are, or using that negative EC, and if you are going to be using an f5.6, that means you're going to easily get down to half a second, quarter of a second, you know, somewhere in there, eighth of a second, you know, and that's where camera shake can begin entering into the picture, especially considering in order to take the photo, you got to push the little red button, and there's some forwards and backwards movement. So make sure you use a tripod when you're shooting in this kind of an area. That'll help you stabilize your shots. It'll help get rid of any kind of creep that you would get from shutter shake. Well, you're not really going to get shutter shake, you're going to get trigger shake, and it'll really help quite a bit. So if you're going to plan to shoot outside, definitely take a tripod with you or find a surface that you can sit it on. Otherwise, practicing holding it and taking the photo is going to be kind of tough. Another thing to consider when we're using this is that since this camera highlights or waits for the shadows, that means it's very easy to blow out your highlights. So when you're out in a brighter environment, make sure that you are being aware of the highlight and try to block the highlight areas of the sky with something in the not as distant background. Meaning, if you want to get pictures of the blue sky, you can. You're going to definitely need a small aperture, f22, f16 with negative exposure compensation. And if you're shooting a picture with quite a lot of sky, you're definitely going to need f22 with negative exposure compensation. Now, that's going to help you get the blue, but mind you, you want to make sure that you don't get any vignetting, so adjust your aperture gingerly, means softly, so that you can feel the natural detint where it sits. Otherwise, you're going to get some vignetting. However, when we continue our talk about the highlights and photographing for these highlights, not here, outside when I'm not in the shade, you can fill the background area with something such as trees in the background that are darker, and I'm talking distant, 20, 30, 40 feet away. The exposure value of the sky is extremely bright compared to something like buildings. So if you're taking portraits and you wish to use a larger aperture with a quicker shutter speed with the negative exposure compensation, then you can, as long as you try to mask that really, really bright part of the sky with something else in the background. It could be a crowd of people if you're shooting at a downward angle. It could be maybe even the ocean, the water a little bit if you're at a pier. It could be buildings behind that make a really interesting bokeh effect. It could be anything. But if you have the bright sky in there, there's a good possibility you're going to blow out those highlights. So definitely stop down the aperture. Those have been just a few tips for using the TL70 and get the very best out of this camera. I find it to be exceptionally capable. I find the lens to be extremely warm and have a very smooth contrast curve. I love the saturation, and people everywhere I go love the images. And this camera allows me to get chatty and meet people and get talking with them and make a new friend. And that's all about part of the experience, isn't it? So I have a great time with this camera. I hope that you do as well. Follow me here on YouTube. If you're only watching here, you're only getting half the story. Go check me out on Instagram at RobHammPhoto, where you can find all the images that I've been taking. I want to thank you for watching and remind you that I will catch you on the flip side.